The red notice flapped against the front door, caught in the afternoon breeze. Jake clenched his jaw as he ripped it free, already knowing what it was. Another fine. Another ridiculous, infuriating, soul-sucking fine. His eyes skimmed over the familiar legalese, and there it was in bold, non-compliant exterior decoration $250 penalty. His stomach twisted. This time it was for a garden gnome. A stupid, harmless garden gnome his niece had given him for his birthday. The screen door creaked as he stepped inside, dropping the paper onto the growing stack on his kitchen counter. It sat there like a pile of unpaid ransom notes, each one signed with the same smug, looping signature. Karen Whitmore, HOA president. Jake had dealt with difficult people before. He'd lived in apartments with nightmare landlords, worked under micromanaging bosses, and even handled his share of grumpy neighbors. But nothing, compared to the tyrant who ruled over Sycamore Grove. He still remembered their first conversation, back when he'd been naive enough to think an HOA was just a formality. It had been his first week in the neighborhood, the scent of fresh paint still lingering in his home. He'd been watering his front lawn when a woman in a pressed beige blazer and oversized sunglasses strode toward him with a clipboard clutched to her chest. "Mr. Walker, I presume?" she'd said, offering a thin-lipped smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Welcome to Sycamore Grove. I wanted to personally introduce myself as the president of our homeowners association. We take great pride in maintaining the aesthetic integrity of our community." She handed him a thick packet, bound and tabbed like a legal document. He had barely flipped past the first few pages before she launched into a speech about harmonious color palettes and strict but fair guidelines for acceptable decorations. "Of course, you won't have any issues if you just follow the rules," she had added with a patronizing little chuckle. "We like to keep things orderly here." It hadn't taken long for him to realize that orderly was just a polite way of saying Karen wanted control. And she exercised that control with an iron fist. The first fine had come after Halloween. He had strung up a modest set of orange and purple lights, nothing gaudy, just enough to give his porch some festive spirit. The next morning a violation notice was taped to his door. "Unauthorized seasonal decorations, $100 fine." Then came Christmas. He kept it simple, a single wreath on his front door and a few icicle lights along the roof. "Excessive exterior modifications, $200 fine." It wasn't just him. Karen policed the neighborhood like a dictator, issuing citations for minor infractions. A car parked 2 inches over a driveway line, a porch light bulb that was the wrong shade of warm white, a basketball hoop left out too long. Every interaction with her felt like a courtroom proceeding, with her as judge, jury, and executioner. Jake had tried reasoning with her at first. "You know this is insane, right?" he had said, waving one of the notices at her. "You can't just nickel and dime people for existing." Karen had merely adjusted her sunglasses, giving him a look of condescending pity. "Mr. Walker, the rules are very clear. If you don't like them, you're welcome to move somewhere less refined." It was then that he understood. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She enjoyed this. The power, the control, the ability to make people bend to her will. Now, standing in his kitchen, Jake exhaled slowly, pushing down the simmering frustration. He reached for the latest fine, crumpled it in his fist, and tossed it into the trash. The gnome stayed exactly where it was. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, he sat on his porch with a beer in hand. Across the street, Karen was making her usual rounds, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning for violations. She moved with purpose, pausing at one house to scribble something down before continuing. When she reached his property line, she slowed. Jake watched as her gaze flickered to the gnome, her nostrils flaring. She turned her attention to him, lips pursing like she had just sucked on a lemon. "You got my notice, I assume," she said smoothly, her voice laced with false civility. "I did," Jake said, taking a slow sip of his beer. "Appreciate the personal touch. Really brightens my day." Her expression remained unreadable, but he caught the flicker of irritation in her eyes. "Then I trust you'll be removing it. Non-standard lawn ornaments disrupt the uniformity of our community." Jake leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs out. "See, I was thinking about that. But I took another look at the rulebook, and it doesn't actually specify garden gnomes as a violation." Karen's jaw tightened. "The guidelines are meant to be interpreted with a level of discretion. That's why we have the HOA, to ensure good judgment is applied." "Ah," Jake said, nodding. "Good judgment. Right." He let the silence stretch. "You ever think maybe you take this a little too seriously?" Her eyes hardened. "I uphold the integrity of this community. It's people like you, people who think the rules don't apply to them, who lower property values and create disorder. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. You really love this, don't you? Telling people what they can and can't do. Karen's smile was tight. I love maintaining excellence. She turned sharply on her heel, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked away. Jake watched her go, his fingers tapping against the bottle in his hand. This wasn't going to stop. Karen wasn't going to stop. And if she wanted to play this game, maybe it was time he played back. The morning air was crisp, the sky a bright, cloudless blue, one of those deceptively beautiful days that hid the chaos waiting beneath the surface. Jake stepped onto his porch, stretching his arms only to freeze mid-motion. Another red notice. It was taped in the usual spot, flapping slightly in the breeze, a scarlet flag of tyranny. His jaw tightened as he pulled it free, already bracing himself for whatever nonsense Karen had conjured up this time. Exterior holiday decor beyond acceptable timeframe, $500 fine. His eyes darted to the offending item, a single wreath hanging on his front door. A plain, simple wreath with no lights, no ribbons, nothing flashy. It had been there for weeks, blending into the dark wood of the doorframe, forgotten. And yet somehow, Karen had found it offensive enough to warrant the highest fine yet. Jake let out a sharp exhale, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't just about rules. This was personal. The thought simmered in his mind as he crumpled the paper and stalked back inside. He had tried to be civil. He had tried to play by the rules. But no matter what he did, Karen found a way to make him the villain in her little neighborhood dictatorship. Maybe it was because he hadn't cowered like the others, hadn't immediately bent to her ridiculous demands. Maybe it was because he had questioned her authority, called out her absurdities. Whatever the reason, she had made it her mission to break him down, one petty fine at a time. Not happening. He needed to fight back. At first, he considered the direct approach. A formal complaint to the HOA board? A lawyer? But that would take months, maybe years, and the idea of wasting time in bureaucratic red tape made his skin crawl. He could ignore the fines, but Karen had ways of making life miserable for rule breakers. Constant harassment, legal threats, even pushing to have non-compliant homeowners removed from the HOA entirely. No, logic wouldn't work. He had to be smarter. So Jake did what Karen would never expect. He grabbed the HOA rulebook and started reading. Page after page of dry legal jargon, restrictions on paint colors, grass height requirements, limits on fence decorations. Karen had used every inch of it as a weapon. But as he scoured the document, something caught his eye. Property aesthetics must adhere to legal zoning codes but are otherwise at the discretion of the homeowner. His pulse quickened. There were no specific restrictions on house color. Nothing about approved shades or acceptable palettes. No mandatory consultation for exterior paint changes. Which meant, legally speaking, he could paint his house whatever color he wanted. A slow grin crept across his face. If Karen wanted to punish him for minor aesthetic violations, then he'd show her what a real eyesore looked like. The next few days were a blur of research and planning. Jake spent hours browsing the most obnoxious, stomach-churning paint colors on the market. He wasn't just looking for ugly, he was looking for offensively hideous. Something that would make Karen's skin crawl every time she looked at it. Finally, he found the perfect combination. A blinding, almost radioactive shade of neon green for the base, accented with clashing streaks of deep, violent purple. It was an assault on the senses, a color scheme so viscerally unpleasant that even the paint store employee had winced when Jake placed the order. You sure about this, man? The guy had asked, eyeing him like he was committing a crime against humanity. Never been more sure of anything in my life, Jake had said, sliding his credit card across the counter. The paint arrived in massive buckets, and with every stroke of the brush, Jake felt a cathartic rush of satisfaction. The pristine, beige conformity of Sycamore Grove was being defiled in the best possible way. The walls radiated like toxic sludge under the afternoon sun, the purple accents jagged and chaotic, creeping along the trim like veins of some monstrous beast. By the third day the job was complete. His house now looked less like a suburban home and more like a cautionary tale against bad decisions. And then he waited. The reaction was immediate. The morning after the final coat had dried, Jake stepped onto his porch with his coffee, enjoying the absolute silence that had fallen over the street. It was as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath, horrified. Across the street, Karen stood frozen in her driveway, her clipboard dangling uselessly at her side. Her lips parted slightly, her breath visibly hitching as she took in the monstrosity before her. Jake took a slow sip of coffee, locking eyes with her over the rim of his mug. Her face turned a deep shade of red. She whipped out her phone, furiously typing, no doubt summoning the HOA council for an emergency meeting. Jake leaned against the railing, watching the storm he had just unleashed. Let the games begin. Karen moved fast. By midday she had assembled her inner circle, 3 other HOA board members, all just as obsessed with order as she was. They gathered on the sidewalk across from Jake's house, whispering in furious tones, their faces twisted in horror. Every now and then one of them would glance at the house, squinting like the color might physically hurt them. Jake sat in a lawn chair on his porch, sipping another coffee, enjoying the show. Then Karen broke from the group and stormed across the street. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement, her fists clenched so tightly around her clipboard that her knuckles had gone white. Mr. Walker. He exhaled, set his mug down and smiled lazily. Morning, Karen. Lovely day, isn't it? She didn't take the bait. What is this? She demanded, waving a hand at the house like it personally offended her existence. My home, he said, stretching his arms behind his head. Just gave it a fresh coat of paint. This is unacceptable, she hissed. Is it? He tilted his head, feigning innocence. Because I checked the HOA regulations, twice actually. There's nothing against painting your house whatever color you want, as long as it follows city zoning laws. And guess what? It does. Karen's eye twitched. The HOA board will not tolerate this, she snapped. You will be issued a violation notice immediately. Jake leaned forward. For what, exactly? She hesitated. That split second of hesitation told him everything. She had nothing. No actual rule to enforce, no legal ground to stand on. And she knew it. Still, she straightened her shoulders, masking her uncertainty with sheer arrogance. You have violated the spirit of the community guidelines. Jake laughed. Actually laughed. The spirit? Karen, are you hearing yourself? Her jaw tightened. This is an eyesore, she pressed, voice lowering into something sharp and venomous. Property values will plummet because of you. I can promise you the HOA will take action. Jake stood, closing the distance between them, his easygoing demeanor turning cold. Go ahead, he said quietly. Find me. Take it to the board. Call your lawyers. But I know the rules better than you do, Karen. And this time, I win. For the first time since he'd met her, Karen didn't have a retort. She just stood there, seething, her carefully constructed authority cracking at the edges. Finally, she spun on her heel and stalked back across the street, barking orders to her board members. One of them pulled out their phone, presumably calling a lawyer. Jake smiled to himself. Let them try. Word spread fast. By that evening, neighbors were walking by just to get a glimpse of what was now being referred to as the nuclear eyesore. Some people loved it, kids pointed and laughed, a few younger couples even gave him a thumbs up as they passed. Others looked scandalized, whispering to each other as though speaking too loudly might make the colors even more aggressive. And then the real fun started. Karen, true to her word, had filed an official complaint with the HOA, demanding an emergency hearing. A formal letter arrived at Jake's doorstep the next morning, summoning him to a meeting in 2 days' time to discuss urgent violations of neighborhood standards. He almost felt bad for her. Almost. When the day came, the HOA clubhouse was packed. Residents who had never bothered to attend a single meeting suddenly showed up, eager to watch the battle unfold. The air buzzed with anticipation. Karen sat at the front of the room, her expression a mask of practiced neutrality, but Jake could see the way her fingers twitched against her clipboard. He took his seat directly across from her, stretching out like he owned the place. Mr. Walker, she began, her voice smooth but strained. Your recent alterations to your home have caused quite a stir. Flattered, he said. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. The HOA has reviewed your modifications and determined that they are disruptive to the overall harmony of Sycamore Grove. As such, we are requesting that you repaint your house to a more appropriate, neutral color. Jake raised an eyebrow. Requesting? Her smile thinned. Requiring. There it was. He leaned forward. Under what rule? Karen stiffened. The HOA board reserves the right to enforce aesthetic standards that align with the... No, Jake interrupted, waving a hand. I asked for a rule, Karen. A specific bylaw that I've broken. The room fell silent. Karen's lips pressed together into a tight line. Jake pulled out a printed copy of the HOA regulations and flipped to the page he had highlighted. Because I found the section on exterior modifications and funny enough, there's no mention of paint colors. He turned the page for dramatic effect. Nothing about needing HOA approval. Nothing about a neutral color palette. So unless you're about to change the rules right now, I'm in full compliance. Someone in the back snorted. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen's nails dug into her clipboard. This is a deliberate attempt to mock the HOA. Absolutely, Jake said. And it's working. A smattering of laughter broke out. Even a few of the board members looked amused. Karen's face turned a dangerous shade of red. This is not a joke. The board will be voting on a mandatory color policy effective immediately. Jake shrugged. Go for it. But you can't make a rule retroactive. Whatever you pass won't apply to me. More whispers. More murmurs. Karen's fingers curled into fists. You're ruining this neighborhood. Jake smiled. Nah. I think I'm just ruining your day. And for the first time in her reign as HOA queen, Karen had no power to stop him. Karen wasn't done. Jake could see it in the way she sat at the HOA meeting, rigid and calculating, her lips pressed so tight they were nearly colorless. She had lost the battle, but Karen Whitmore was the type of person who didn't accept defeat, she plotted. For the next few days, the neighborhood buzzed with whispered conversations, stolen glances toward his house, and the occasional phone camera snapping pictures as people passed. Some were entertained. Others scandalized. But none of it compared to the sheer, seething rage brewing behind Karen's cold, unreadable expression. Then, exactly 1 week after the meeting, it happened. Jake stepped onto his porch that morning, stretching, when he noticed something strange. A row of city maintenance trucks lined the street. Workers in reflective vests were speaking in hushed tones near his mailbox, their eyes darting to his house. And at the center of it all, standing with her arms crossed like a queen surveying her kingdom, was Karen. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, her expression triumphant. "Morning, Mr. Walker," she called, loud enough for the workers to hear. "I assume you received our notice?" Jake frowned. "What notice?" Karen let out a soft, theatrical sigh, shaking her head. "How unfortunate. The HOA sent a letter informing you that the board has filed a formal complaint with the city. As it turns out, your house violates multiple neighborhood safety ordinances." Jake narrowed his eyes. "What ordinances?" Karen smiled sweetly, pulling out a folder. "Excessive brightness causing potential driver distraction. Use of non-traditional exterior pigments that disrupt visual uniformity, which may interfere with emergency services' ability to identify the home. Oh, and my personal favorite, failure to maintain a home in accordance with community aesthetic standards, leading to a direct negative impact on property values." Jake let out a sharp laugh. "You made that last one up." "The city didn't seem to think so," Karen said, tilting her head. "As you can see, I've arranged for an inspection. If your home is deemed non-compliant, you will have 15 days to repaint it, or you will be fined $1,000 per day until the issue is resolved." One of the city officials hesitated before stepping forward. "Sir, we do have a formal complaint on record. We'll need to conduct a review." Jake exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Karen had found a loophole. The HOA couldn't touch him, so she had gone above them, twisting city regulations into a weapon. If the city sided with her, she could drain him financially, force him into compliance through sheer persistence. She was smiling now, her confidence back in full force. She had him cornered. Unless... Jake's mind raced, sifting through every detail he had read in the HOA guidelines, every ridiculous restriction Karen had enforced on the neighborhood. His gaze flickered over the workers, the officials, the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered to watch. And suddenly he saw it. The perfect, devastating counterattack. He turned back to the city inspector, his voice calm, measured. "By all means, inspect away. But before you do, I'd like to file my own formal complaint." Karen blinked. "Excuse me?" Jake gestured vaguely toward the row of houses. "As a resident of this community, I believe it's my duty to ensure that all homes meet the exact same level of scrutiny." He crossed his arms. "For instance, did you know Karen's house has a decorative fountain in her front yard? Pretty sure that's a direct violation of the HOA's water feature regulations." Karen's expression flickered. The city official hesitated. "That would be a matter for the HOA too." "The HOA has a responsibility to ensure every home is compliant," Jake interrupted smoothly. "And since Karen is the former president, oh, right, did I mention the board voted her out last night? It only seems fair that we examine her property as well." Karen's eyes widened slightly. "You're bluffing." Jake smiled. "Am I?" One of the workers, clearly enjoying the drama, tapped a clipboard. "Actually, we do have to document all formal complaints, ma'am. If your property is also non-compliant, it would be subject to the same penalties." The crowd murmured. Karen's composure faltered. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "My home is." "Let's check," Jake cut in. "You wouldn't have anything to hide, would you, Karen?" The official sighed, clearly exhausted. "We can review both properties." Karen stood frozen. She knew what he knew. That her house, while pristine to the untrained eye, was far from compliant. The extra-wide driveway she had installed without HOA approval. The unauthorized extension on her back patio. The decorative wrought iron gate that directly contradicted the HOA's fencing policies. She had skirted the rules for years, enforcing them selectively, assuming no one would dare challenge her. Now she was trapped. Her face paled as the official gestured for his team to begin the inspection. Jake leaned against his porch railing, watching as they started documenting her violations, their pens scratching against their clipboards with every new infraction. One of the board members, a woman who had clearly suffered under Karen's reign, turned to her with a saccharine smile. "Oh dear, Karen. Looks like you'll have to make some adjustments too." The color drained from Karen's face. 15 minutes later, the verdict was in. Jake's house, despite its obnoxious color, was fully compliant with city regulations. Karen's, however, had racked up over 6 separate violations, each carrying hefty fines and mandatory corrections. She stood there, shell-shocked, as the official handed her a thick packet of paperwork. "You'll have 30 days to rectify these issues before fines begin accumulating," he informed her. "Failure to comply may result in legal action." Jake couldn't stop the grin that spread across his face. "Tough break, Karen." She didn't respond. Didn't move. Just stood there, staring at the papers in her hands like they were written in a language she couldn't understand. By the time the trucks left and the crowd dispersed, she looked smaller somehow. Defeated. And Jake? He stood on his neon-green porch, lifted his coffee mug in a silent toast to his beautifully hideous home, and savored the sweet, undeniable taste of victory.